clock was ticking down to midnight, July 28th, 1914. But 5 years earlier, the most dangerous man in Europe sat under a palm tree and wrote a love letter. It was sent to his cousin, the Tsar. That letter, and the delusion of peace it represented, was the last thing keeping 200 million people from absolute war. The sender was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The recipient was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. They were cousins, both grandsons of Queen Victoria, and for years they had exchanged a series of messages, the infamous Willie-Nicky telegrams, a private channel of diplomatic back and forth, couched in the language of family and affection. The note, written from the Kaiser's favorite villa on the island of Corfu, was utterly divorced from the brutal reality of the two bristling war machines they commanded. The Kaiser saw himself as a simple man, a lover of flowers and art, trapped by the burdens of rule. He described the beautiful watercolors, the shade of fine palm trees, and the lovely, quiet Greek people. He complained to the Tsar, "We poor rulers, it seems, are not entitled to holidays like other simple mortals, because a revolution had forced him to work." Yet, even in his vacation, the Kaiser was compelled to make grand, theatrical statements. At his Achillean palace, which he had purchased from the Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary, a giant statue of Achilles stood. Upon its base, the Kaiser had the inscription carved, "To the greatest Greek from the greatest German." This was the Kaiser's style, tremendous modesty married to immense ego-driven power. This contrast between his personal affectation and his imperial ambition defined his reign. He often blamed the media for the geopolitical tensions, telling the Tsar that more dangerous and at the same time more loathsome is that part of the press which writes what it is paid for. They incite the hostility of one nation against another. The Kaiser saw himself as a lover of peace, forever surrounded by po-faced naysayers who refused to recognize his genius. The truth was that the personal friendship of the Kaiser and the Tsar was the final, fragile, emotional safety net preventing European escalation. 3 weeks earlier, that net had been fatally shredded. In the distant, dusty city of Sarajevo, a nationalist had assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. On Saturday, the 25th of July, 1914, the 48-hour ultimatum issued by Austria-Hungary to Serbia had expired. Scenes of brief drunken celebration erupted in Vienna, yet across Europe, policymakers still hoped the catastrophe could be averted. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, was desperately trying to organise a mediation conference in London. However, the window for diplomacy was closing fast. Germany, Austria's lone staunch ally, would not support the conference, believing Vienna was entitled to swift retribution and should not be dragged before a court for justifiable defensive measures. The British cabinet, particularly the Liberal members, was paralysed. John Burns, president of the Board of Trade, summed up the mood of disbelief. Why 4 great powers should fight over Serbia, no fellow can understand. Even the British Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith, seemed detached. Despite the gravity of the situation, he was consumed by his relationship with Venetia Stanley, a friend of his daughter, and was betraying cabinet secrets in his letters to her. Following a gloomy cabinet meeting, he casually wrote that he'd rather get Violet to beat up 1 or 2 people, dine at home, and play bridge than worry about the crisis. The highest echelons of British power were still treating the approaching storm like an unwelcome distraction from their card games and social routines. They were complacent because the Kaiser, the very figure whose aggression they feared, had been away for 3 weeks on his yacht, the Hohenzollern, sailing the Norwegian fjords. The moment the Kaiser was presented with the ultimatum's text, he was initially surprised, calling it a firm note. Yet he remained convinced there would be no general conflict. He could not contemplate the reality of war, seeing himself as a man of peace, perhaps even a Mr. Toad, who would always back away from the final plunge. But as the crisis deepened, he was recalled to Berlin. On Monday, the 27th of July, his Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, had specifically instructed him to avoid the city centre, fearing that a public demonstration would be misconstrued as a step toward war. Reluctantly, the Kaiser followed orders, but his aides were still certain disaster would be avoided. His adjutant, Hans von Plessen, wrote in his diary, "We hope to localize the war. England declares that she wishes to remain neutral." The belief in Berlin was that the British, led by their Anglo-friendly ambassador, Prince Lichnowsky, would certainly stay out. The crisis was accelerating, driven by the belief in localized conflict. Yet, it was the Kaiser who, early on Tuesday, the 28th of July, would throw the first wrench into the machinery of escalation, not by aggression, but by an ill-timed flash of common sense. He rose early, riding at 7:30 in the morning before tackling 3 weeks of missed paperwork. Among the documents was the full Serbian reply to the Austrian ultimatum. The Kaiser was astonished. Serbia had accepted nearly every demand. He erupted, "Oh my God, this is unbelievable. The Serbians have accepted everything. A great moral victory for Vienna. It removes every reason for war." These were not the words of a monster itching for slaughter. They were the panicked words of a man scrambling for a reason to cling to peace. He could not understand why Austria had not simply declared victory. He immediately concocted what he believed was a brilliant compromise. Given that the Serbian capital, Belgrade, was so close to the Austrian frontier, why didn't the Austrians simply occupy the city peacefully? It would serve as a deposit, a measure of retribution for the crime, without triggering a general conflict. Historians would later call this an act of common sense that many of his more academic officials lacked. But the General Staff was missing one crucial piece of the puzzle. The Kaiser, convinced of his own brilliance, was about to propose an insane compromise that could either stop the war entirely or guarantee the end of their alliance. He had the answer, a simple, elegant solution. Yet the men who truly controlled Germany's armies refused to believe their emperor. They ignored the only chance they had to stop the coming slaughter. To his general staff, who were banking their prestige and careers on an aggressive war, this was a ridiculous gimmick. They refused to sell the idea to their Austrian allies, transmitting it in such a vague, half-hearted way that Vienna easily dismissed it. They said they couldn't risk annoying their only ally. Austria, meanwhile, was finally ready to act. On that same Tuesday, exactly a month after the murder of the Archduke, Emperor Franz Joseph signed the declaration of war on Serbia with an ostrich feather quill at his summer residence. In his proclamation, the multi-ethnic empire was forced to draw the sword against an enemy filled with hatred, assuring the world it was an act of defensive aggression. But the Austrian foreign minister, Count Berchtold, then committed an act of astonishing negligence, asking General Conrad, the Chief of Staff, whether they had plans for Russian intervention. The answer, shamefully, was no. At this point, you might be following along and wondering what comes next. History has countless stories of pivotal moments and figures whose narratives deserve to be heard. If you enjoy this kind of in-depth, dramatic historical storytelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. The war had been declared, Yet Austrian forces were still days away from a full attack. Across Europe, the sense remained that the crisis could still be contained. The final moment of diplomatic maneuvering was over. Now, a month after the Archduke's assassination, the world would finally hear the first official sound of the greatest war in history. But that night, just after midnight, the 29th of July, the moment of no return arrived. A massive explosion ripped through the darkness outside Belgrade. Serbian forces, including agents linked to the Archduke's assassination, blew up the railway bridge, the crucial link between the city and Austria-Hungary. Shortly afterward, an Austrian river warship, the Bodrog, came into view in the darkness, opening fire on the Serbian positions and the ancient Kalemegdan citadel. The shots were designed as revenge for Franz Ferdinand. They were also the first shots of the Great War. St. Petersburg, July 29th. With the sound of cannons echoing over the Danube, the world began to move. The Tsar, deeply troubled, carried the weight of a monumental choice to his bed. Would he order a partial mobilization, sending a warning to Austria, or a general mobilization, preparing the entire Russian Empire for war against Germany? His decision would unleash the Schlieffen Plan, a clockwork of war years in the making, and shatter the peace of a continent. The Russians were compelled to act quickly. Because their empire was so vast and lumbering, it would take weeks longer than Germany or Austria to marshal and move their men and materiel. They believed they had to steal a march on the Central Powers. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Sazonov, went straight to the Peterhof Palace to convince the Tsar to sign the order for general mobilization. He argued that if they did not, the Central Powers would strike first, and it would be too late. The option of doing nothing was not on the table. Nicholas II was an irritating man, stubborn and autocratic, but he abhorred the thought of war. He was surrounded by ministers egging him on, yet he feared the monstrous slaughter that general mobilization would bring. He sent a desperate telegram to his cousin, the Kaiser, begging him, in the name of their old friendship, to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. The Kaiser, upon receiving the wire, was genuinely touched. He sent a return telegram, assuring his cousin he was trying to restrain the Austrians and promising that Vienna would not seize any Serbian territory. He pleaded with the Tsar not to mobilize, arguing that it would make mediation impossible. When Tsar Nicholas read the Kaiser's message that evening, he was ecstatic, believing his cousin had come through after all. He immediately called Sazonov and reversed his position on general mobilization, telling the foreign minister he would not be responsible for the slaughter. He said the German emperor had frequently assured him of his sincere desire to safeguard the peace of Europe. Sazonov was gutted. He and the general staff saw the Kaiser's words as a deception. They had already prepared the order for general mobilization. They spent the next day, Thursday, the 30th of July, pestering the Tsar, arguing that war was unavoidable and the Germans were gagging for a fight. Nicholas lost his temper on the phone, threatening to cut off his war minister. Finally, at 3 o'clock that afternoon, Sazonov visited the Tsar at Peterhof. He wore him down, arguing that a refusal to mobilize would lead to Russia being smashed. At 4 o'clock, the Tsar relented. The foreign minister immediately telephoned the army chief of staff and ordered the decree to be transmitted. The general, in turn, told the operator, "Smash the telephone after the order goes through, so the Tsar cannot change his mind again." In the central telegraph office in St. Petersburg, the machines began to click and tap, sending the order out across the Russian Empire. It was a step that, once taken, could not be undone. The news was a bombshell for Germany, the moment they had been dreading and preparing for, not just for weeks, but for years, had arrived. Their entire strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, was predicated on Russia being slow. Now, they were in danger of falling behind. The Kaiser, at his palace, was ranting and raving, calling the Russians absolute dogs. His staff presented him with the order to declare a state of imminent danger of war. He insisted on standing up to sign the martial law decree, feeling the weight and drama of the moment. Then, his attention snapped back to Britain. He had to assume Britain would stay neutral, relying on the word of his cousin, King George V. Yet, as evening fell, the Kaiser's paranoia took over. He felt betrayed by his cousin Nicholas. He went on a spectacular shriek of rage, blaming England. "The famous encirclement has become an accomplished fact," he cried. "The net has suddenly been pulled over our head." He believed the entire crisis was a long-cherished, purely anti-German plot. "Edward VII is stronger after death than I am who is still alive." While the Kaiser descended into hysteria, the French, the quiet party in the alliance, were playing a brilliant, cynical game. President Poincaré and his foreign minister, René Viviani, understood that the key to victory lay in bringing Britain into the war. The Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, Abel Ferry, articulated their strategy. "We must show to the English public and the English government that France, like Russia, will not be the first to fire. Make the Germans the bad guys." The plan was to ensure German aggression created the perfect moral case for British intervention. For a deeply personal story that defined the first act of the war, let us know what you think in the comments below. London, August 3rd, 1914. The clock was ticking towards 0. While holiday crowds gathered at the cricket pitch and the seaside, unaware that the War Office had plans to requisition the Oval for bayonet practice, the British cabinet still hoped against hope to avoid the catastrophe. For days, Sir Edward Grey had been walking a tightrope. He had offered the mediation conference, but he had also, in private, made promises to the French. He told his colleagues that morning, "The time has come for plain speaking. War is coming, and I don't believe we can afford to see France crushed." He warned them that if they did not support their long-standing, though informal, ally, he would resign. The cabinet, a majority of whom still favoured peace, were paralysed, but the consensus was slowly shifting. The issue of the hour, the great question that would override all others, was Belgium. Grey's lawyers had confirmed that Britain was legally bound by treaties signed in 1839 and 1870 to guarantee Belgium's independence. He and the cabinet members knew that the German strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, required their armies to sweep through the northern, undefended plains of Belgium to bypass the strong French fortifications further south. The question was, how would Britain react? Some members of the Liberal cabinet argued that intervention would be a calamity for the civilized nations. Then, the Germans made probably the single most ludicrous strategic error of the entire crisis. The British had discussed the possibility of the Germans only going through the southern tip of Belgium, in which case the British would likely have done little. But that evening, the Germans gave their ambassador in Brussels an ultimatum. "Let our armies pass through Belgium peacefully, or we will crush you." They believed this move was necessary to forestall British intervention. It was the one thing that guaranteed it. At noon on Tuesday, the 4th of August, King Albert of Belgium sent a formal appeal to Britain for help. He then put on his uniform, mounted his charger, and rode through the streets of Brussels, arriving at the Belgian Parliament. He went to the chamber and spoke in French to the assembled deputies. "Gentlemen, are you determined at any cost to preserve the sacred heritage of our forefathers?" As one, they shouted in return, "Oui, oui, oui." The Belgians had rejected the ultimatum, casting the deciding vote for Britain. That afternoon, Sir Edward Grey went to the House of Commons to deliver what many consider one of the 2 or 3 greatest speeches in that body's history. It was a lawyer's brief, a perfectly calculated mixture of national interest and moral authority. He argued that the German action violated international law and threatened British security, as the French coast was undefended because Britain had encouraged Paris to move its fleet south. He condensed the entire complex dispute down to 2 simple points: British honour and Belgian neutrality. He appealed to the members to look into his own heart and his own feelings and to construe the extent of that obligation for himself. He warned them, if France is beaten and we have stayed out, we would sacrifice our respect and good name and reputation before the world. His oratory was so effective that it single-handedly invented the propagandistic British narrative for the war, that the conflict was not about Serbia or power bloc competition, but about defending plucky little Belgium against the barbarous German steamroller. Berlin, August 4th. In the Imperial Palace, the supreme warlord, Wilhelm II, received his deputies. Before him sat a table cut from the timber of HMS Victory, Admiral Nelson's flagship, a table made from an English gift, now used as an altar of sacrifice for war with Britain. The Kaiser, now using his new cherished title, the Supreme Warlord, had fully embraced his role. He was in his helmet and uniform, and he received every deputy at the Reichstag, declaring that Germany would draw the sword with a clear conscience and with clean hands. The conflict was framed to the German people not as an aggression, but as a fight for the nation's very existence against a conspiracy of jealous rivals. Then came the final, tragic confrontation. As the deadline for the British ultimatum approached, the British ambassador went to see Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. The Chancellor was a broken man, overwhelmed by the strategic and moral disaster of the Belgian invasion. He burst into tears as the ambassador confirmed Britain's entry into the war. Bethmann Hollweg had always seen the war as a defensive struggle against a terrible, encircling fate. He saw the British joining the fray as the ultimate betrayal, a strike against a kindred nation who wants nothing better than to be friends with her. He demanded to know the reason for this cataclysmic choice. The ambassador cited the treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. The Chancellor exploded, the famous rage reflecting the strategic desperation of his situation. "But at what price?" he cried. "You were fighting just for a word. Neutrality, just for a scrap of paper." That single arrogant phrase, the scrap of paper, was a gift to the British. It was instantly seized upon by propagandists as the proof that Germany had no respect for international law, that its word meant nothing, and that the war was a moral crusade. As the interview ended, the British ambassador, composing himself to avoid breaking down in public, had to retreat to an antechamber. It was shortly after the interview that the news reached the waiting men in Downing Street. The German telegram, if one was even sent, had been cut. At 11 o'clock British time, Big Ben struck the hour. In the cabinet room, Sir Edward Grey was seated with Prime Minister Asquith, Winston Churchill, and Richard Haldane. They heard the sound of a great crowd that had assembled outside the Palace of Westminster, singing, "God Save the King," welcoming the war. Grey rose and walked to his window, looking out over Birdcage Walk. Dusk was falling. "The lamps are going out all over Europe," he said to a colleague who stood beside him. "We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." It was just a few minutes later that a signal flashed from the Admiralty across the world to Britain's fleet. It read simply, "Commence hostilities at once against Germany." The world was at war. The siege of Belgrade, like the final days of peace in 1914, is a powerful story of how leadership, faith, and the unbelievable courage of ordinary people can overcome impossible odds. It proves that history isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest hearts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the historical decisions that shaped the modern world, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories of titanic moments and incredible leaders. Share this video with a friend who loves history, and leave us a comment below telling us what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.